The morning started like any other in the Brentwood neighborhood, a quiet, sun-drenched Sunday that masked the horror waiting just behind the gates of a $13.5 million estate. But inside that sprawling home, an unthinkable tragedy had unfolded, one that would shake Hollywood, the Reiner family, and anyone who believed in the safety of family ties. Rob Reiner, the legendary director whose films had defined generations, and his wife Michelle were brutally murdered. Their son, Nick, was arrested that very night, facing charges of first-degree murder. And now, for the first time, the family was speaking out. Their youngest daughter, Romy Reiner, had broken her silence, her voice trembling with grief as she recounted a nightmare no one could imagine. Rob was not just killed, he was stabbed 100 times. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine the scene. A mansion built to exude safety and success transformed into a crime scene of incomprehensible horror. The kind of scene that makes you question everything you thought you knew about wealth, fame, and family. You wonder, how could this happen in a home filled with love and laughter just days before? How does a family recover when the horror originates from someone they trusted above all else? And most urgently, what really happened that night? These are questions that journalists, fans, and friends of the Reiners alike have been grappling with since that chilling Sunday. This story is not just about a murder. It is about the collapse of a family empire, about grief too deep for words, about the psychological forces that can twist love into betrayal. For Romy and her siblings, Jake and Nick, the pain is unimaginable. For the public, the shock is mesmerizing. And for the investigators, it is a case that seems to straddle both tragedy and a thriller. One moment, you see the surface, celebrity, privilege, glamour, and beneath it, an abyss of secrets and human complexity. Let's rewind a little. Rob Reiner was more than just a Hollywood director. He was a storyteller, a creator of worlds that captivated millions. From classics like This Is Spinal Tap to beloved family films that spanned decades, Reiner's career was a testament to his creativity and influence. But the man who could command a set and navigate the complexities of show business was also a father, a husband, and a pillar of a family that had its own private universe. His children grew up under the glare of Hollywood spotlights, but in a home that, on the surface, appeared grounded, loving, and supportive. They were three very different siblings navigating fame, fortune, and the subtle pressures that came with it. Jake, the eldest, often described his parents as nurturing yet demanding, balancing their careers with the challenges of raising children in the public eye. Romy, the youngest, absorbed it all quietly, observing the dynamics with a careful eye. And then there was Nick, the middle child, whose trajectory would take a dark and shocking turn no one could have predicted. As with any family, the Reiners had disagreements, moments of tension, and differences in personality. But it's hard to imagine that the ordinary friction of siblings could escalate to violence of such magnitude. Yet, that Sunday it did. The details that emerged in the immediate aftermath were almost too shocking to process. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed to death, in their home, by someone they trusted implicitly, their own son. The fact that such violence could erupt in a space of supposed safety is what makes this story both horrifying and compelling. And now, as Romy speaks, the world gets a rare glimpse into the human heart in the midst of unimaginable loss. Romy's statement was brief but devastatingly powerful. She described the pain of losing her parents in terms that are almost impossible to fathom. "We are experiencing unimaginable pain," she said, speaking alongside her brother Jake. "This is a horrific and devastating loss." And then she revealed the unimaginable, the brutal nature of Rob's death. Hearing the words, "He was stabbed 100 times," is almost unbearable. The repetition, the sheer violence, the intimate horror, it's more than a statistic. It is a testament to the depth of the horror that has befallen this family. Imagine the fear, the confusion, the grief that these words evoke. Romy's voice, breaking under the weight of sorrow, is not just an account of a crime. It is an insight into the raw reality of human suffering when trust is betrayed at the highest level. And yet, even in this statement, there is a tension, a curiosity that demands attention. Why did Romy decide to speak now? What compelled her to address the public amid her grief? These are not just questions about the timing of her words, but about the nature of the pain that has been silenced until now. Speaking out is an act of courage, especially when facing media scrutiny, legal processes, and personal trauma. Romy's words are a window into a world where grief, fear, and the search for answers collide. And they set the stage for a deeper exploration of the events leading to that night, the family dynamics, and the chilling aftermath of the crime. But before we can fully grasp the gravity of Romy's revelations, we must understand the context. The family history, the relationships, the patterns that existed long before tragedy struck. This is not merely about a moment of violence. It is about years of experiences, interactions, and choices that culminated in the unimaginable. We will look at the childhoods of Jake, Romy, and Nick, the parenting styles of Rob and Michelle, the pressures of growing up in a high-profile family, and the moments that hinted at tension beneath the surface. We will explore not only the horror of the crime itself, but also the human story, the emotions, the motivations, and the shocking contradictions that make this case so compelling. As we navigate this story, prepare for a journey that alternates between the public and the private, the shocking and the intimate, the known and the mysterious. Each revelation, each insight, will raise new questions. How did the Reiner family appear so perfect, yet harbor secrets that would erupt into violence? What signs, if any, were there that something was wrong? And ultimately, how do Romy and Jake begin to process a loss that is both unimaginable and public? The answers will not come easily, and the story itself unfolds in ways that are as complex as the people at its center. We also must consider the broader implications. The murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner is not just a family tragedy, it is a cultural event. Hollywood has rarely seen such a personal, brutal crime within a celebrated family. The media attention is intense, the speculation rampant, and the public is hungry for answers. But beneath the headlines, the flashing cameras, and the social media outrage, there is a human story that cannot be summarized in a single sentence or reduced to clickbait. It is a story of love, betrayal, grief, and the desperate search for understanding in the aftermath of a crime that defies comprehension. And so, as we begin this journey, ask yourself, what would you do if faced with the unthinkable? If the person you trusted most betrayed you in the most violent way possible? If the parents you loved were taken from you in a moment of horror? How do you process grief when it is intertwined with shock, fear, and public scrutiny? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions Romy and Jake face every single day. And through exploring this story, we begin to understand not just the crime, but the human capacity for resilience, for seeking truth, and for finding meaning in the face of overwhelming loss. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. We are about to dive deeper into the Reiner family legacy, the siblings' relationships, and the fateful events leading up to that Sunday. The story is far from over, and every revelation brings us closer to understanding a tragedy that seems almost scripted in its shocking intensity. From the seemingly idyllic beginnings of a Hollywood family to the horror that unfolded behind closed doors, the truth is more complex, more emotional, and more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The next chapter begins with the story of the Reiner family. How they lived, how they loved, and the subtle tensions that existed even in a household that seemed perfect from the outside. But even as we explore these beginnings, one question lingers. Could anyone have predicted the horror that would one day strike the heart of this celebrated family? The answer is both heartbreaking and terrifying, and it sets the stage for the story Romy Reiner has just begun to tell, a story of love, loss, and the shattering consequences of betrayal. The Reiner name is one that carries weight, recognition, and a certain undeniable gravitas in Hollywood circles. Rob Reiner, the man whose sudden, brutal death has now shocked the world, wasn't just a filmmaker. He was an institution. He was a storyteller whose work shaped generations, whose films became touchstones for both comedy and drama, satire and sincerity. But behind the accolades, awards, and red carpet glamour was a man whose life extended far beyond the screen. A husband, a father, and a figure whose personal world now lies in tragic ruins. It's easy to look at someone like Rob Reiner, and see only the public persona. The director of iconic films like This Is Spinal Tap, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men, was known for his talent, his charm, and his ability to elicit both laughter and tears from audiences worldwide. Yet for Romy, Jake, and Nick, he was simply Dad. He was the man who attended school plays, who listened to their grievances, who celebrated their milestones and weathered their missteps. Michelle Reiner, his partner of decades, was equally pivotal, a stabilizing presence, a mother whose warmth and attention helped shape the childhoods of three very different children. Together, they created an environment that, on the surface, seemed idyllic, a Hollywood version of stability amid a world often defined by chaos. But appearances can be deceiving. What makes the tragedy of Rob and Michelle's death all the more devastating is not just the violence, but the way it contrasts with the life they led. The Brentwood estate, sprawling and elegant, with manicured lawns and gated privacy, had long been a symbol of their success. It was a home that suggested safety, comfort, and continuity. And yet, in that very home, a family's life was shattered in a way almost no one could imagine. The murder didn't happen in a back alley or some anonymous location. It happened in a place meant to protect, to shelter, and to nurture the lives within its walls. It is a cruel irony that forces us to confront the fragility of human safety, even when surrounded by privilege and love. For Romy Reiner, the youngest of the three children, this home was more than just a structure. It was a repository of memories, small and large, that now carry the weight of grief. She remembers birthday parties, family dinners, quiet Sunday mornings, and moments of private laughter. Each memory is now imbued with an impossible sorrow, the knowledge that what was once a sanctuary became a site of unimaginable horror. Jake, the eldest, carries his own memories of growing up in a household where creativity and achievement were expected, yet where love was abundant. And Nick, the middle child, is now at the center of this tragedy, the alleged perpetrator in a crime that has shaken everyone who knew the family. Understanding the Reiner family legacy requires more than a biography of Rob's professional accomplishments. It requires a glimpse into the emotional architecture of a household that seemed harmonious, yet, like many families, had its tensions, its undercurrents, and its private conflicts. The Reiners were a family of contrasts. Public success versus private struggles, warmth versus unspoken stress, love versus the seeds of conflict that would later culminate in tragedy. This duality is crucial to understanding how a family capable of great affection could also experience a rupture so extreme. The upbringing of the Reiner children offers insight into both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the family. Jake, as the eldest, bore the responsibility of being a role model, often expected to navigate the public eye with poise. Romy, thoughtful and observant, internalized much of the family dynamic, absorbing tensions quietly and developing a sense of empathy and emotional intelligence that would later define her public statements about the tragedy. Nick, whose path has now ended in devastating accusations, demonstrated a complexity that was perhaps less understood by outsiders. A mix of ambition, frustration, and private struggles that were never fully visible to the public. Together, the siblings formed a microcosm of a household whose external appearance masked the intricate emotional landscape beneath. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Reiner family was their ability to balance extraordinary public lives with private intimacy. Rob and Michelle maintained a household where creativity was encouraged, expression was valued, and individuality was respected. Yet, even within this environment, challenges existed. Sibling rivalries, differences in personality, and the pressures of fame created moments of tension. These moments, while not uncommon in any family, now take on a tragic significance in light of the events that transpired. They remind us that even the most seemingly secure families are not immune to the fractures of human emotion. As we consider the Reiner legacy, it is also essential to acknowledge the broader social context. Hollywood families, by nature, live under an unrelenting public gaze. Success brings scrutiny, and scrutiny often amplifies existing tensions. The Reiners were no exception. Their achievements brought admiration, but also expectations and pressures that could influence family dynamics in subtle and profound ways. For Romy, navigating adolescence and young adulthood under these conditions required resilience, awareness, and a capacity to balance personal identity with public perception. These early experiences, shaped by both love and pressure, are now part of the larger narrative of loss, grief, and the search for understanding. And yet, amid the success and the challenges, the Reiners cultivated a sense of unity. Family vacations, holidays, and everyday rituals fostered bonds that, before tragedy, seemed unbreakable. These moments of connection provide the emotional backdrop against which the horror of that Sunday night is most sharply felt. They are reminders that the Reiners were, first and foremost, a family, a unit bound by love, shared experience, and mutual care. The stark contrast between these cherished memories and the violent reality of their deaths is what amplifies the tragedy to nearly unbearable levels. It is also impossible to ignore the role of Michelle Reiner in shaping the family environment. Often, the mother's influence in such households is understated, yet Michelle's presence was central to the emotional cohesion of the Reiner family. Her nurturing, her attentiveness, and her commitment to her children created a counterbalance to the demands of Hollywood and the pressures of public life. Her absence is now felt with acute intensity, not only in the loss of a mother, but in the collapse of a guiding emotional force within the family. Romy's grief, as she has expressed it publicly, reflects both the personal loss of a parent and the disruption of the emotional foundation that Michelle provided. The Reiner family legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry woven from professional success, personal achievement, love, tension, and now, tragedy. To fully comprehend the events that have brought us here, we must examine not only the outward-facing elements of fame and career, but also the internal dynamics of family life, the subtle patterns of interaction, and the psychological undercurrents that shape behavior. Only by understanding these elements can we begin to grasp the profound shock and grief experienced by Romy and Jake, and the horrifying actions allegedly committed by Nick. This legacy, however, is not only historical. It is immediately relevant. Romy Reiner's decision to break her silence, her willingness to speak publicly about her father's death, brings a human face to a story that has largely been mediated through sensational headlines and fragmented reports. Her words allow the public to engage with the emotional reality of the tragedy, to understand that beyond the celebrity and the wealth, there is a family-enduring loss that defies comprehension. It is through this lens that the story truly begins, moving from the realm of fact and speculation into the territory of human experience, empathy, and emotional resonance. But what comes next will reveal how the private tensions, individual struggles, and intricate family dynamics of the Reiners converged on that fateful day, setting the stage for a tragedy that is both shocking and profoundly human. The story of the Reiner family legacy is just the beginning. Because understanding where they came from is essential to understanding how a family of love, laughter, and achievement could be irrevocably shattered in a single, horrific moment. Every family has its dynamics, its unspoken rules, its patterns of love, rivalry, and tension. The Reiner family was no different. On the surface, the children, Jake, Romy, and Nick, appeared to inhabit a world of privilege and stability. They had a father who was a celebrated filmmaker, a mother who provided warmth and guidance, and a home that offered security in both the physical and emotional sense. Yet, beneath that veneer, each sibling was a distinct personality, navigating their own paths, desires, and challenges. Understanding these differences is key to understanding how the events of that fateful Sunday unfolded. Jake, the eldest, often carried the weight of expectation. In families, the eldest child is frequently tasked, implicitly or explicitly, with being a model for the younger siblings, a bridge between parents and siblings, and a stabilizing presence. Jake took on these roles with varying degrees of ease. He was both protective and observant, aware of the pressures that fame and parental expectations imposed on his siblings, and at times, aware of the undercurrents of tension that ran through the household. He was, in many ways, the lens through which Romy and Nick perceived certain aspects of family life. His personality combined empathy with responsibility, and in retrospect, Those qualities made his grief and shock all the more piercing when tragedy struck. Romy, the youngest, was quieter but no less perceptive. Her observations often captured nuances that others missed. Growing up in a household as public as the Reiners, Romy learned early to navigate scrutiny, both in private interactions and in the glare of outside attention. She internalized much, watching interactions, noting differences, and quietly absorbing the emotional landscape of the family. Romy's temperament was reflective, sensitive, and deeply empathetic, qualities that now define her public statements about the murder of her parents. Her voice, trembling yet resolute, reveals the depth of a person who has witnessed, internalized, and now must articulate a trauma few can comprehend. Her perspective offers a unique window into the family dynamic, the love, the laughter, and the invisible tensions that existed alongside them. Then there was Nick, the middle child, whose trajectory is now central to the public narrative. Middle children often experience the dual pressure of living up to the eldest while carving out a unique identity in comparison to the youngest. Nick's life, however, would come to be defined not just by the pressures of birth order, but by the complex interplay of personality, opportunity, and private struggles. Those who knew him described a person capable of charm and ambition, but also of restlessness and intensity. The juxtaposition of Nick's public demeanor and private behavior is stark, and understanding this duality is critical to comprehending the shocking allegations against him. He was the sibling whose choices, for reasons still being pieced together, culminated in an event that shattered the family. The dynamics among the siblings were shaped by love, rivalry, and mutual dependence. Like many families, moments of friction existed alongside moments of intense connection. Jake and Nick would argue over decisions. Nick and Romy would clash in subtle ways, and Jake and Romy would find themselves in positions of mutual support. These patterns were normal, yet in hindsight, they provide insight into the complex emotional environment that framed the family. The interplay of differing personalities, expectations, and coping mechanisms created a delicate balance. One that, tragically, would be disrupted in a single, catastrophic night. One of the defining aspects of sibling relationships is how they interact under stress. In the Reiner household, moments of stress were often amplified by the public visibility of their lives. Family decisions, conflicts, and even minor disagreements carried the weight of scrutiny. The children had to navigate these pressures while developing their own identities, a challenge that shaped each of them in profound ways. For Romy, the path was one of observation and reflection. For Jake, it was responsibility and mediation. For Nick, it was ambition and, perhaps, unresolved tension. These differences, innocent in ordinary circumstances, became significant in understanding the emotional landscape of the family and the tragic events that followed. It is also important to note that the Reiner children were not isolated from the broader realities of their parents' world. Hollywood, fame, and the pressures of celebrity added layers of expectation, judgment, and opportunity. They were exposed to adult conversations, professional challenges, and social dynamics that shaped their perspectives from a young age. While their upbringing was loving, it was also complex, demanding adaptability, resilience, and awareness. Each sibling internalized these lessons differently, which influenced both their behavior and their interactions with each other. Despite these differences, the siblings shared moments of connection that now appear poignant in retrospect. Family traditions, shared interests, and collective experiences created bonds that were strong, even if imperfect. They laughed together, celebrated milestones, and, like any siblings, occasionally quarreled. These memories, now overshadowed by tragedy, serve as a reminder of the human dimension of the Reiner family. They were not simply figures in a news story. They were, and are, individuals bound by shared history, love, and loss. The events leading up to the fateful Sunday must be understood in the context of these sibling dynamics. Tensions that may have seemed ordinary or trivial at the time can, under extreme circumstances, escalate in ways that are unforeseeable. While no one could have predicted the horror that would occur, the personalities, interactions, and unspoken pressures within the family contributed to a fragile equilibrium. Understanding the unique traits of each sibling, the protective nature of Jake, the introspective sensitivity of Romy, the complex ambition and intensity of Nick, allows us to see how ordinary human dynamics can intersect with extraordinary tragedy. Romy's eventual public statement reflects not only her grief, but her understanding of this complexity. Her words convey shock, sorrow, and an awareness of the profound fracture that has occurred. Yet, she also demonstrates a capacity for clarity and emotional articulation, a reflection of both her personal character and the family environment that shaped her. Similarly, Jake's measured, supportive public voice underscores his role as the eldest and as someone striving to process grief while maintaining family cohesion. Meanwhile, Nick's position is central to the unfolding story. The allegations against him are shocking precisely because they involve a family member, a person who, in theory, should embody care and trust. The sibling dynamic that once contained ordinary quarrels and rivalries is now redefined by acts that defy comprehension. How and why this shift occurred is part of the investigation, part of the psychological puzzle, and part of the narrative that will dominate public and familial discourse for years to come. It is also worth examining how birth order, personality traits, and family expectations intersected in the Reiner household. Jake's leadership, Romy's empathy, and Nick's intensity created a dynamic that was both supportive and volatile. This is not to suggest that the tragedy was inevitable. Far from it. But rather that understanding these interactions provides critical insight into the familial and emotional environment in which the crime occurred. The nuances of sibling relationships, especially in a high-pressure, high-visibility family, can have profound implications, both in ordinary life and in moments of crisis. Beyond individual personalities, the shared history of the siblings is crucial. Childhood experiences, family rituals, and formative events created a sense of collective identity. Even as they navigated personal differences, they shared memories, attachments, and a bond that would later be tested under unimaginable circumstances. These shared experiences make the betrayal and loss all the more poignant. They remind us that the story is not simply about crime. It is about human relationships, the fragility of trust, and the profound consequences of familial rupture. As we move forward, it is essential to carry with us an understanding of the siblings as complex individuals, each shaped by love, expectation, and circumstance. Their interactions, their struggles, and their personalities provide the framework for understanding the events of that fateful day. Romy's voice, Jake's measured presence, and Nick's alleged actions are not isolated. They are part of a continuum of family history, emotional patterns, and human behavior. Appreciating this complexity is vital to grasping both the immediate tragedy and its broader implications. And yet, even with this understanding, one question looms. How did these sibling dynamics intersect with the events of that Sunday night? How did personalities, histories, and interactions contribute to a tragedy that seems almost unimaginable? The answers lie ahead, as we explore the family's tensions, the moments leading up to the crime, and the unfolding horror that would forever alter the lives of Romy, Jake, and everyone connected to the Reiners. But what comes next will reveal the subtle strains, hidden conflicts, and unseen pressures that existed in the Reiner household. Pressures that, when combined with circumstance, set the stage for a catastrophe that no one could have predicted. The story of the siblings is only beginning, and the revelations to come will deepen the mystery, heighten the suspense, and challenge everything we think we know about trust, family, and the human capacity for both love and violence. Every family has its cracks, subtle or overt, that run beneath the surface of daily life. The Reiner household, despite its wealth, glamour, and the seemingly perfect veneer of Hollywood success, was no exception. On the outside, friends and colleagues saw a united family, parents devoted to their children, children supportive of one another, a home that appeared secure and loving. But beneath that carefully curated exterior were signs of strain, tensions that were quiet yet persistent, tensions that would later form the undercurrent of a tragedy almost impossible to fathom. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone outside the home. Minor disagreements that escalated more than they should have, quiet resentments that lingered in hallways, small arguments over household routines or personal choices. To an outsider, these would seem ordinary, even trivial. But within the Reiner household, they were markers of deeper emotional undercurrents, moments where stress, expectation, and individual personalities collided. Families under pressure often develop patterns where small irritations magnify into emotional flashpoints. In the Reiners' case, the pressures were compounded not just by everyday life, but by the public attention surrounding their names. Nick, the middle child, was often at the center of these tensions. As someone who navigated both personal ambition and family expectations, he sometimes displayed impatience, frustration, and mood swings that were difficult for others to navigate. His siblings, Jake and Romy, observed him with a mix of concern and caution. There were reports of arguments over seemingly minor disagreements, decisions about household responsibilities, personal space, and lifestyle choices. While such disputes are common in any family, the intensity of emotion behind them hinted at unresolved issues that had been accumulating over time. Friends and insiders noted that Nick could become volatile when confronted with criticism or perceived slights, and though these moments rarely escalated beyond private disputes, they were signs of a deeper emotional turbulence. Jake and Romy, for their part, were aware of these undercurrents. Jake, as the eldest, often tried to mediate, attempting to calm tensions and maintain peace. Romy, observant and sensitive, internalized much of what she saw, often shouldering emotional weight quietly. Both siblings sensed that beneath the laughter, family outings, and holiday celebrations, there were moments of tension and emotional complexity that required careful navigation. They learned to read subtle cues, to anticipate moods, and to temper interactions in order to avoid conflict. In hindsight, these were coping mechanisms in a household where underlying stress sometimes simmered just below the surface. Beyond sibling dynamics, there were broader pressures within the household. Rob Reiner, though beloved and respected, was a figure of authority whose standards, expectations, and high-profile career added a layer of intensity to family life. Michelle, though nurturing, also had her own expectations and ways of managing the household. The balance between parental authority and child independence is delicate in any family, and in the Reiners' case, it was magnified by external pressures, Hollywood expectations, social scrutiny, and the demands of public perception. Every interaction was informed not only by personal dynamics, but by the larger context of fame, expectation, and visibility. Friends and colleagues later remarked that, in private, there were occasional glimpses of strain that contrasted sharply with public appearances. Rob, for example, could be deeply compassionate, yet also exacting in ways that were challenging for the children. Michelle's nurturing nature was sometimes accompanied by a firmness that underscored household rules. The combination of high expectations, personality differences, and the pressures of public life created a subtle but persistent tension, a kind of emotional background hum that few outsiders would notice but that shaped daily life for the family. Another layer of strain involved the children's individual paths and ambitions. Jake, as the eldest, faced expectations both from his parents and from himself, striving to balance personal aspirations with family responsibilities. Romy, introspective and sensitive, often navigated her environment cautiously, absorbing the emotional atmosphere around her. Nick, ambitious and intense, sometimes struggled to reconcile his personal goals with the expectations of family and society. These differences, while normal in many households, were intensified by the family's wealth, visibility, and the emotional intensity of the home environment. Financial and lifestyle factors also played a role in creating strain. The Reiners' estate, though lavish and designed for comfort, came with its own set of expectations and routines. Living in such a high-profile home required attention to security, presentation, and public perception. Subtle disagreements about money, household responsibilities, and autonomy occasionally arose, adding to the undercurrent of tension. While none of these factors alone would have predicted the horror that unfolded, they contributed to an emotional landscape where stress, frustration, and unspoken grievances could accumulate. Perhaps the most telling signs of strain were emotional reactions that seemed disproportionate to circumstances. A small argument could quickly escalate, or a tense silence could linger for hours, suggesting unresolved issues beneath the surface. These moments were rarely observed by outsiders, but within the household, they contributed to a sense of fragility, a family operating under a veneer of normalcy while emotional currents flowed quietly but powerfully beneath. Observers later reflected that these patterns were not unusual for families in high-pressure environments, but in the Reiner household, they were intensified by the combination of fame, wealth, and complex sibling dynamics. It is also important to consider how communication patterns within the family may have contributed to tension. Families often develop unspoken rules about what can be said and what must remain unsaid, especially in households where privacy is highly valued. In the Reiner's case, certain topics may have been avoided or only discussed in limited ways, creating pockets of misunderstanding or frustration. When emotional stress is not openly addressed, it can fester, leading to moments of conflict or emotional breakdown. In hindsight, these communication gaps may have been subtle precursors to the extraordinary events that would later unfold. Despite these strains, the Reiner household remained functional and outwardly loving. There were moments of joy, shared accomplishments, and familial support that balanced the tensions. The family celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones with the same warmth as any other family, and these moments were crucial in maintaining cohesion. Yet, the contrast between public happiness and private strain illustrates a fundamental truth about human relationships. The appearance of harmony does not always reflect the emotional reality beneath. This tension was particularly significant in the context of Nick's relationship with his parents. Reports suggest that he occasionally experienced frustration or resentment toward household rules, parental expectations, and sibling dynamics. While normal in adolescence and young adulthood, these feelings, if left unaddressed, can intensify over time. Emotional patterns that might be manageable in ordinary families can become volatile when combined with personality traits, familial pressure, and high-stakes environments. These factors help illuminate how an otherwise ordinary household could experience extraordinary emotional strain. Romy's later reflections and public statements provide insight into her awareness of these tensions. She has described the family as loving yet complex, acknowledging both the warmth and the challenges inherent in their relationships. Her perspective underscores the duality of family life, deep affection coexisting with subtle, sometimes unspoken, difficulties. Understanding these nuances is critical, not just for comprehending the family dynamic, but for grasping the emotional landscape in which the tragedy occurred. The signs of strain in the Reiner household, therefore, were multifaceted: subtle sibling conflicts, personality differences, parental expectations, lifestyle pressures, communication gaps, and the intensity of living under public scrutiny. Each factor alone might seem manageable, but together they created an environment where emotional volatility could simmer beneath the surface of apparent normalcy. These were not signs of inevitable disaster, but they were indicators of the complexities and pressures that shaped the family's daily life. And yet, even amid these strains, the Reiners maintained a sense of cohesion, care, and routine that is characteristic of resilient families. They navigated disagreements, supported one another, and preserved moments of connection that now, in the wake of tragedy, appeared deeply poignant. The juxtaposition of normal family life with underlying tension highlights the fragile balance that existed, a balance that would soon be shattered in a way no one could have anticipated. But what comes next will pull us closer to the fateful weekend itself. The series of events, interactions, and emotional moments that set the stage for the horror that would unfold in the Brentwood estate. The subtle strains we've explored were more than background details. They were threads in a complex tapestry of family life, threads that would intertwine with circumstance, personality, and tragedy to produce a night that no one could have imagined. The weekend that would change the Reiner family forever began like any other, deceptively ordinary and quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath before the storm. On the surface, the Brentwood estate appeared serene, sunlight filtering through tall trees, birdsong punctuating the stillness, the kind of peacefulness that suggests security, stability, and domestic normalcy. But beneath that calm, the forces of tension, unresolved emotion, and circumstance were aligning in ways that no one could have anticipated. By the end of the weekend, the Reiner family would be unrecognizably fractured, leaving behind a scene of horror that would shock Hollywood and the world alike. Sunday morning started quietly, with Rob and Michelle following their usual routines. Friends and neighbors later recounted seeing the couple in seemingly normal spirits earlier in the week. There were no public signs of impending danger, no frantic calls, no overt confrontations, no announcements of conflict. In private, however, the undercurrents of family tension, the sibling dynamics, the subtle strains, the unspoken grievances, continued to exist. These were the emotional landscapes that the family had navigated daily, patterns familiar enough to be ignored in ordinary circumstances, but significant enough that they formed the backdrop for the events that were about to unfold. Nick Reiner, the middle child, had been living in the guest house on the property, a separate structure that provided him with privacy and independence. It is not uncommon for adult children in affluent households to occupy their own space, but this physical separation also carried an emotional distance, a space where unresolved conflicts, personal frustration, and psychological pressures could intensify without immediate mediation. In the days leading up to the tragedy, insiders reported that Nick had been experiencing emotional volatility, moments of irritability, and frustration that were unusual even by his own patterns. While these moments might have seemed contained, they contributed to an escalating emotional tension that would culminate in disaster. As Sunday progressed, the estate was quiet, almost eerily so. There were reports from neighbors of a calm that masked the storm, a kind of normalcy that would make the events to come all the more shocking. Within the house, the family's routines continued in a way that belied the emotional undercurrents beneath. Romy and Jake, if present at the estate that weekend, would have been aware of the quiet tension, moments of pause, glances exchanged, subtle shifts in behavior. The ordinary domestic rhythm, the making of breakfast, movement through rooms, the hum of household tasks, carried with it the invisible weight of unresolved stress. Then came the moments that would mark the beginning of an unthinkable tragedy. According to reports from law enforcement and investigative sources, the first signs of crisis were subtle. The patterns that might have gone unnoticed in another household, the sudden loud argument, the tension in conversation, the sharpness in tone, manifested in ways that signaled danger. The Reiner home, designed to provide comfort and security, became the stage for a rupture in familial harmony, a space where private grievances and psychological pressures would collide with catastrophic consequences. Rob and Michelle, who had always been central figures of authority and care within the household, were caught in the crossfire of these dynamics. The couple, both in their late 70s and early 70s respectively, maintained routines that reflected their personalities, disciplined, organized, and attentive to both family and household management. But on this fateful day, these routines were disrupted in ways that would prove fatal. Details from law enforcement reports indicate that what began as an ordinary sequence of domestic interactions quickly escalated, turning a home of comfort into a site of unimaginable horror. The escalation, according to preliminary investigations, was rapid. The exact sequence remains under scrutiny, but it appears that an intense conflict arose between Nick and his parents, one that neither mediation nor previous familial experience could contain. The argument, intense and emotionally charged, would culminate in violence. The very presence of a household steeped in love, memory, and family bonds could not prevent the eruption of this lethal force. For a family so accustomed to routines and stability, the speed and intensity of the escalation were shocking and unprecedented. Neighbors and law enforcement later described the scene with a combination of disbelief and horror. Rob and Michelle were found in circumstances that defy comprehension, stabbed repeatedly, a level of violence suggesting not just anger but profound rage. The number of injuries reported, 100 stab wounds, indicates an intensity of emotion and action that is almost unimaginable. Each wound, each act, represents not only a physical assault, but also a symbolic rupture of familial trust, the destruction of the very foundation of safety and love that the Reiners had built over decades. The fateful weekend also underscores the tragic irony of circumstance. A family accustomed to safety, privacy, and predictability found itself subject to a sudden and extreme violation. The guest house, intended as a space of independence for Nick, became the physical and psychological site from which events escalated into tragedy. The home, which had long represented a sanctuary for the Reiners, was transformed into a scene of violence that would redefine every relationship, every memory, and every narrative associated with the family. For Romy and Jake, the immediate aftermath of the weekend is difficult to imagine. The shock of discovering, or even learning of, the murder of their parents by their own brother is an emotional trauma that defies conventional understanding. It is not simply grief. It is a complex web of horror, betrayal, confusion, and disorientation. Romy's later statements reflect this intensity. The pain of losing both parents, the shock of knowing the alleged perpetrator is a sibling, and the overwhelming burden of processing these events under public scrutiny. Jake's role as the eldest adds another layer. Responsibility not only for his own grief, but for supporting Romy, navigating the legal and media attention, and trying to maintain some semblance of familial cohesion. The fateful weekend also emphasizes the role of timing, circumstance, and the human mind in moments of crisis. Often, tragedies occur not as isolated incidents, but as the culmination of patterns, emotional, psychological, and situational, that have been building over time. In the Reiner household, the subtle strains, sibling dynamics, and personal pressures created a fertile context for catastrophe. The specific interactions, choices, and emotional states of that Sunday converged in a way that was both sudden and devastating, transforming ordinary domestic life into a nightmare scenario. Law enforcement reports, media accounts, and eyewitness recollections all paint a picture of rapid escalation, intense conflict, and horrific outcomes. While the details of the precise timeline remain under investigation, the broad strokes are clear. The weekend that began with the potential for ordinary domesticity ended in a tragedy of extraordinary violence. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of familial success and stability, became a place forever associated with loss, shock, and horror. And yet, even in this darkness, there are threads of understanding to be found. The fateful weekend, horrific as it was, reflects broader truths about human emotion, family dynamics, and the consequences of unresolved tension. It underscores how quickly ordinary stress, personality differences, and private grievances can escalate into events with irreversible consequences. It also highlights the fragility of safety, even in environments designed to provide comfort, security, and predictability. As the story moves forward, we will examine the precise discovery of the crime, the immediate response of law enforcement, and the shocking details of the scene that unfolded that Sunday. The fateful weekend is not just a backdrop. It is the pivot point around which the entire narrative rotates, the moment when tension, personality, and circumstance collided in a way that would forever alter the lives of the Reiners and those who knew them. Understanding this weekend is essential to understanding the scope, impact, and profound horror of what occurred. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The discovery of the crime, the immediate response, and the first public accounts would shock the world, laying bare not only the brutality of the act, but the complex web of family dynamics that had set the stage for it. The story of the fateful weekend is only the beginning. The prelude to a sequence of events, revelations, and emotional reckonings that will challenge every assumption about family, trust, and the human capacity for violence. The discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies on that fateful Sunday night marked the moment when tragedy shifted from rumor to undeniable reality. Until that point, the horror that had quietly begun in the Reiner household existed largely as an unseen tension, a private escalation of emotion within the family. But once law enforcement entered the Brentwood estate, the unimaginable became visible, and the world was forced to confront a scene of violence that no one could have anticipated. The discovery itself would set the tone for an investigation filled with shock, grief, and questions that, even now, remain difficult to answer. It began with calls from concerned neighbors. Some had noticed unusual activity at the estate. Lights flickering at odd hours, doors that appeared open when they should have been closed, or the absence of any movement that would normally accompany a family of that size and prominence. Yet in an affluent neighborhood like Brentwood, such anomalies are often dismissed. People live with security systems, privacy fences, and the assumption that inside the gated estates, families manage their own affairs. But this weekend, the anomaly would prove catastrophic. Law enforcement sources later reported that Nick, the middle son, was the initial focus of attention. The circumstances leading officers to the estate involved a combination of emergency calls and investigative leads that indicated potential harm to the residents. When the police entered the Reiner home, what they encountered was beyond what anyone could have prepared for. 2 bodies, Rob and Michelle, each bearing evidence of a brutal attack. The scale of violence, particularly the reported 100 stab wounds inflicted on Rob, conveyed a level of rage and intensity that is rarely encountered even in criminal investigations involving family members. The investigators on the scene quickly recognized that this was not a random act of violence. The location, the method, and the relationship between perpetrator and victims all pointed to a crime of profound personal significance. Unlike burglaries, robberies, or opportunistic assaults, this attack was intimate, focused, and devastating in its execution. The distinction is critical. It frames the crime not as an external threat, but as a rupture within a family, one that combines personal betrayal with extreme violence. It is a reality that challenges both investigators and the public to reconcile love and horror, intimacy and brutality. Witnesses and law enforcement described the discovery with a mix of disbelief and horror. The scale of the attack, the placement of the bodies, and the immediate evidence of struggle suggested that the violence had escalated rapidly, leaving little opportunity for intervention. For officers trained to handle the most shocking situations, the Reiner case stood out not only for its intensity, but for its emotional weight. There was no ambiguity about the personal nature of the crime. The evidence pointed unequivocally to someone within the family circle. In these early moments, investigators had to process both the forensic evidence and the human tragedy, the knowledge that this was not only a homicide, but the destruction of a family from within. Nick's arrest that night, just hours after the discovery, marked a turning point in the narrative. While details of his behavior immediately prior to law enforcement's arrival are still under investigation, sources indicate that officers were able to secure the scene and take him into custody without incident. The speed of the arrest provided immediate answers to one pressing question: who was responsible? But introduced a cascade of additional questions about motive, psychological state, and the sequence of events leading up to the attack. How could a son commit such an act? What led to this moment? Could the signs of strain within the household have predicted this outcome? These questions would dominate the investigation, the media coverage, and the family's processing of grief in the days and weeks that followed. The immediate aftermath of the discovery also revealed the complexity of the emotional response within the family. Romy, still processing the shock of the weekend, faced the dual burden of grief and public exposure. In her first public statement, she described the loss as unimaginable and recounted the horrifying details of her father's death with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. The intensity of her words underscores the emotional trauma of the discovery itself, not just the knowledge of her parents' deaths, but the awareness that those deaths were the result of a profound familial betrayal. Jake's response, similarly, was one of measured grief, attempting to balance personal mourning with the responsibility of supporting Romy and navigating a public narrative fraught with speculation and attention. From a procedural standpoint, the discovery set in motion a meticulous forensic investigation. Law enforcement teams collected evidence, documented the scene, and began reconstructing the sequence of events. Every detail, from the placement of objects in the home to the forensic analysis of the wounds, was scrutinized for insight into the motive, timing, and execution of the crime. Experts would later emphasize that the brutality of the attack, combined with the intimacy of the victims and the perpetrator, required a careful approach both legally and psychologically. Investigators were not only analyzing a crime scene. They were also attempting to piece together the emotional and relational dynamics that had culminated in this moment of horror. Media coverage of the discovery added another layer of complexity. Within hours, the news had spread worldwide, creating an intense spotlight on a family already grappling with unspeakable loss. Public reaction ranged from shock to fascination, with headlines emphasizing the number of wounds, the celebrity status of the victims, and the involvement of a family member. For Romy and Jake, this immediate public attention compounded the trauma, forcing them to confront both personal grief and the scrutiny of a global audience. The intersection of private tragedy and public fascination highlights the modern reality of high-profile crimes, where human suffering is often broadcast alongside facts, speculation, and emotional narratives. The discovery of the crime also initiated the legal machinery that would define the next phase of the Reiner family tragedy. Nick's arrest, charges of first-degree murder, and subsequent legal proceedings introduced new pressures, new uncertainties, and new dynamics for Romy and Jake. Their roles as siblings, survivors, and witnesses to public perception became intertwined with legal strategy, media narratives, and the societal imperative to understand what had occurred. The discovery, therefore, was not merely an event in time. It was the catalyst for a series of emotional, legal, and social challenges that would dominate the family's life for months, if not years. Finally, the discovery forces us to confront the human dimensions of grief and shock. Beyond the forensic details, the legal ramifications, and the public spectacle, there is the simple, profound horror experienced by a family losing its foundation. Romy's voice, breaking as she recounted the events, offers the clearest window into this emotional reality. A daughter facing the incomprehensible knowledge that her parents were killed by someone they trusted completely. Jake, too, embodies this duality of grief and responsibility. For both, the discovery was not just a moment of confirmation. It was the beginning of a lifelong struggle to understand, process, and survive an emotional event of unparalleled magnitude. But what came next would push the Reiner family, investigators, and the public even further into a landscape of questions, theories, and revelations that no one could have anticipated. The discovery was only the beginning, the entry point into a sequence of events, psychological analyses, and public reckonings that would redefine the family forever. As we move forward, we will explore the immediate investigation, the unfolding legal process, and the first public reactions that shaped the narrative surrounding the Reiner family tragedy. In any murder case, the question that drives investigators, the media, and the public is always the same. Why? Understanding the motive is not only essential for legal proceedings, but also for making sense of a tragedy that otherwise defies comprehension. In the Reiner family case, the search for motive was both urgent and profoundly complicated. The alleged perpetrator was Nick Reiner, the middle child, whose actions have left Romy, Jake, and the world grappling with shock, grief, and disbelief. How could a son commit such an act against his own parents? What forces, psychological, relational, or circumstantial, converged to create this nightmare? The first step for investigators was to examine Nick's life leading up to the murders. Sources indicate that he had been living in the guest house on the Brentwood estate, ostensibly to maintain some independence while remaining close to his parents. This proximity was meant to provide both privacy and support, but it also created an environment where tensions could simmer unnoticed. Friends and acquaintances described Nick as ambitious and intelligent, but occasionally moody, restless, and frustrated with limitations placed upon him by family, circumstance, or life in general. In isolation, such traits are not extraordinary. However, investigators had to consider whether these patterns of frustration could have escalated into violent intent. Family dynamics played a central role in the investigation into motive. Sibling relationships, the pressures of growing up in a high-profile household, and parental expectations were all scrutinized. Jake, as the eldest, often assumed a role of mediator and protector, while Romy, the youngest, observed and absorbed family tensions with sensitivity and emotional intelligence. Nick, caught between the two, may have experienced feelings of inadequacy, resentment, or frustration that remained largely invisible to the outside world. Investigators considered whether unresolved conflicts, personal grievances, or psychological stress could have culminated in the extreme actions that led to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Financial considerations were another area of investigation. The Reiners were a wealthy family, and with wealth often comes complex arrangements, expectations, and pressures. While there is no evidence to suggest that financial disputes alone were the catalyst, investigators explored whether money, inheritance, or the distribution of assets could have influenced Nick's mindset. In many cases of family violence, perceived slights or inequities in financial matters can exacerbate pre-existing emotional tensions, and the Reiner case was no exception. Every potential source of stress, tension, or resentment was examined meticulously to determine whether it might have contributed to the tragic events. Psychological factors also became a focus. Experts in forensic psychology were consulted to help understand potential triggers for extreme behavior. While it is impossible to retroactively diagnose, patterns of frustration, impulsivity, and emotional dysregulation were considered as part of the broader investigation. Nick's personal history, including any prior behavioral issues, emotional struggles, or conflicts with family members, was examined for clues. Investigators looked for patterns that might suggest premeditation, impulsive escalation, or a combination of both. Each detail helped piece together a psychological profile that could explain, if not justify, the actions that led to the deaths of Rob and Michelle. The investigators also considered the immediate circumstances of the fateful weekend. Were there arguments that escalated unexpectedly? Had there been warnings, threats, or signs of extreme agitation? Family members, neighbors, and friends were interviewed extensively to reconstruct the interactions leading up to the tragedy. While the full sequence of events remains under scrutiny, these interviews revealed a family navigating ordinary disagreements and emotional pressures, which, tragically, escalated into violence of unimaginable magnitude. In addition to personal and familial stressors, external factors were analyzed. The Reiners were a prominent family, constantly in the public eye. While there is no indication that fame directly caused the murders, living under continuous public scrutiny can intensify emotional pressures, amplify conflict, and influence behavior in subtle ways.